This will be recorded, and it'll be online where you can go to a YouTube channel and review it if you want to. This class is Kings and Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, of course, B111 in the school catalog. And you should have a copy of the syllabus. Those of you online, I sent it as an attachment. You can print it as a Word document or a PDF. I also sent some information about writing research papers for those of you taking the class for credit, a little background information about what a research paper is and what it's not. That might be helpful to you. Also, how to format and document, so forth. So that might be a helpful reference.
Brother Dave?
Yes.
I have a quick question.
Go right ahead.
So I assumed that your class and the class on Job and the class on some of the epistles were going to be taught consecutively, like you would take part of the semester and then the next class part. Are they being taught simultaneously?
I believe so. Yes, ma'am.
And your class will last the entire semester?
Ma'am, it will. It's the way the classes are set up. They go 15 weeks, 2.5 hours a night. Actually, about 2 hours and 20 minutes of class time. We take a break about halfway through. Now, normally all of these classes at Piedmont Road are recorded and archived, but am I speaking to Mary? You're clearly not Rosalind, so I know Rosalind's voice, so I'm assuming you must be enrolled in more than one class.
Yes, which I did not realize I was doing, but this is the one I would prefer to take, so I'll stay in yours. And
okay, well, get in touch with Brother Tidwell about Job, and then with Keith Dixon. Yeah, Tommy and Keith are both teaching tonight next door.
Yes, I know.
You can get the.
Can't be in 3 places at once.
I was going to say, you can get the link to their archives from each of them if you want to do that.
All right. Thank you, sir.
You are very welcome. You are very welcome. Now, textbook. There is not a required textbook for this class. There is a suggested textbook. In fact, in the syllabus, there's a whole list of suggested reference books, but the one that is a suggested textbook is this little book, which is I won't say it's out of print because you can order it on Amazon. It's in the public domain. It's old enough. This book actually goes back to the late 1800s, but not this copy, obviously. But you can find these. This is A Harmony of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles by William Day Crockett. You can find these on eBay for $5 to $10. And all the information is there in the syllabus. Now, you'll notice if you look under recommended supplementary texts, you'll see this book listed twice. And the first one has an asterisk next to it. And if you just follow that down to the next page, it tells you that's out of the hardback is out of print, but you can get it on eBay. If you don't want to fool around with eBay or you can't find it, you can always go to Amazon, and you'll find it with the title reversed for some reason, a scanned paperback copy of it. And the last time I checked, it was about $17 for a brand new one. But it should be, from what I know of their publication, it should be a good, usable quality copy. There are also a couple of other, several other references there, commentaries on 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The ones by Kaufman there at the end are by a brother in the church, the Davis and the Selman commentaries. Selman, I think, is in the Church of England, and I forget where Ralph Davis is, Dale Davis. But they're good, basically conservative, solid commentaries, worth having if you're going to want to study deeper. Now, those who are taking the class for credit, there is a research paper required. There are 3 suggested topics there in the syllabus on page 4. And if you're taking the class for credit and you have another idea for something you'd like to to study about and write on, you feel free to submit that, and I'll take that under consideration and we can talk about that. And that brings us then to the schedule every Tuesday night from 6:30 to 9 from now until the third Tuesday in April. And because we cover 4 books of Old Testament Hebrew history, and in one sense, we cover everything from Adam to Babylonian captivity. In some ways, this will be a rocket ride as far as covering the material in these books. And we're going to jump back and forth after about next week. We'll be jumping back and forth some between Kings and Chronicles, particularly between 1st and 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles. 2nd Chronicles is actually our textual starting point, because that's the piece of text that takes us all the way back to the Garden of Eden, basically, all the way back to Abraham at any rate. That's where we'll begin here in a little bit. So a little bit of background. These books, Kings and Chronicles, are parallel accounts in many respects. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, and I didn't think to bring a copy with me, I do have a Hebrew Bible, great big thick, written in Hebrew, so it looks like, if you can't read Hebrew, it just looks like a bunch of scratching on page. But in the Hebrew Bible, 1st and 2nd Samuel are one book that's called 1st Kings, or Kings A, and 1st and 2nd Kings are one book that basically are 2nd Kings, or Kings B. The Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, likewise were originally one book in the Hebrew Bible, but it was Jerome, the Latin Catholic era, or early Catholic era scholar, who described these books as chronicles. In the Hebrew Bible, they're called omissions, or things omitted, and they are a parallel to everything in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, why would there be a duplicate of these things in the Old Testament? Isn't one record enough? Well, that's a little bit like asking, okay, we have Matthew, why do we need Mark, Luke, and John? We have 4 accounts, or 4 records of the life of Christ. In fact, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are so similar that they're commonly described as the synoptic, or similar view, gospels. And then John is written later and presents a more detailed but shorter record of the ministry of Christ. It doesn't cover the early life of Christ at all, except in very, very, just a few verses at the very beginning. Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles give us parallel accounts, or you might say a double narrative of these events, because these events are important. One of the fundamental questions that is important to recognize in any kind of Bible study is to notice when something is repeated. Why would God repeat himself? Well, as parents, when we speak to our children, or as employers, when we speak to employees, or supervisors, and we speak to those that we supervise, why do we repeat things? Well, sometimes it's because they're important. And sometimes it's because we want them to make an impact. As a mother of children, you repeat things to your children, don't you? Because you want them to stick with your children. You want them to remember those things. Well, in the scriptures, when God says something and then says it again, that's a visual cue that tells you, hey, sit up, pay attention, this is important. Well, we tend to look at Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and there's a lot of this king fathered that king, and this king did this, and this was good, and that was bad, and this happened, and that happened. And we look at that and say, man, that's ancient history. What does that have to do with us? Well, What that has to do with us is what the Apostle Paul wrote by inspiration in Romans 15 and verse 4. These things were written aforetime. The things that were written aforetime, before this time, Paul says were written for our admonition and our learning. Now, think about that for a minute. He says that in Romans 15. He says that again in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. To whom is he speaking in those books? Paul is speaking to Christians. And what is he telling us as Christians? He's saying the books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Malachi, are recorded and preserved through history, not primarily for the benefit of the Jewish people that lived under that Old Testament law. Now, it served that purpose. It was their Bible. It was their guidance. It was their rule of law. But what does the Holy Spirit tell us through Paul's inspired writing? The primary reason, the overarching reason to have these books in the first place is for Christians to learn, to benefit from. If you think about it, what does the Old Testament show us? From Genesis to Malachi, what do we see in the Old Testament? What lessons do we see? Well, here's where we came from and why we're here and where we're going. Fundamental questions every person asks at some point in life. The overall thread or the overall meta-narrative, the overall story of the Bible is what God is doing in history. But in the Old Testament, you start at Genesis chapter 3 with the fall in the Garden of Eden. And what's the story from Genesis 3 onward through Malachi, pointing toward Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? God's going to do something about this problem of sin. There's a Savior coming. Genesis 3:15, God speaks to the serpent, seed of woman shall bruise your head, you'll bruise his heel. You'll give him a minor injury, he'll give you a death blow, Satan. And that's the whole rest of the Old Testament playing out over the course of history for our benefit. So we come to Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and we looked at 1st and 2nd Samuel last semester in this campus. And so now we're in Kings and Chronicles. We have these parallel accounts. There's a lot of overlap, a lot of repetition, because it's important. At the very least, the fact that it's repeated is a caution to not neglect this part of the Bible. Now, Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, gives us a parallel account of the northern and southern kingdoms. It gives us a side-by-side account of what's going on in Israel, the 10 northern tribes that pulled away under Jeroboam, and what's going on in Judah, the southern tribe with Benjamin added in, that stayed nominally loyal to the Lord. And it's a parallel of what's going on in both kingdoms at the same time. Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, once we get to 2nd Chronicles, concerns itself almost exclusively with the southern kingdom, with Judah, because it is the record of the kings of Judah, basically. Now, 1st Chronicles covers Saul and David and Solomon, and we begin 2nd Chronicles with Solomon. But the perspective in 1st and 2nd Chronicles is this is the record of our kings, of our history, written probably after the exile, after Babylonian captivity, perhaps by Ezra or some other post-exilic writer. Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings, on the other hand, lead up to the time of captivity and are written in real time, as it were, more or less. Whereas Chronicles is a look back. And we'll see as we go along, there's some interesting references, particularly in the Chronicles, although also in Kings, some interesting references to what we would call outside sources. For instance, we'll find reference to the book of the prophecies of Iddo. Well, who's Iddo? We don't have a book of Iddo. Maybe you do. I don't have a book of Iddo in my Bible. But there are references to several outside sources. That does not take away from the inspiration of these books at all. It simply is a reference or a recognition that the ancient Jews kept records. They wrote things down to remember them by. Now, the books of Chronicles, starting in First Chronicles, gives a review of Bible history, basically from the time of Adam down to the end of Babylonian captivity, right through to the conclusion of Babylonian captivity. And then Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther pick up where Second Chronicles leaves off. First and Second Kings is not quite as detailed in that respect. It doesn't start as early, and it gives less detail as we get down to the end. But it's interesting to notice Jesus and the apostles made use of both sets of these books, particularly First Kings. You find First Kings quoted several times in the book of Acts and by Jesus in Luke chapter 4, verses 25 to 27. He quotes from 1 Kings 17, verse 9, and other passages in James and Romans and so forth. So you have a historical background for these things. Now, Christians live and worship and act under the authority of the New Testament. True? We are children of God by faith in Jesus Christ. And what did Jesus say? In Matthew chapter 5, he said of the Old Testament law, the law of Moses, don't think that I came to destroy the law. I did not come to destroy it. This would be verse, what is it, 29, 20, 25. I did not come to destroy it, but to fulfill it. Verse 17, Matthew 5 and verse 17. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Well, what does the word fulfill mean? If you borrow money to buy a house and you make your payments every month, 12 months a year, or 13 payments a year if you're on the every 2 weeks plan, and then you get to the end of your 15-year note or your 30-year note or whatnot, you make that last payment, next month comes around, what do you not do? You don't make a house payment the next month. Why not?
You complete it.
Filled your debt. That's right.
Complete it, the obligation.
So Jesus says, I came not to destroy, but to fulfill, to complete, to finish what was begun, in this case with Moses and the prophets. Now, the Apostle Paul in Colossians 2 and verse 14 tells us that he took the bond written in ordinances out of the way. The Hebrews writer tells us that he took away the first in order to establish the second. Christians live under the law of Christ. Well, why do we need the Old Testament? Well, we talked about these things are written for our learning, but aside from general practical applications, learn from example, the writings of the prophets are not done away. I had an elder one time actually tell me that we didn't need to study the Old Testament because we live under the law of the New Testament. Well, why do we still have the Old Testament? Because God preserved it for a purpose. These writings, these are vital, they're timely, they're interesting, and the lessons that we can draw out of them are badly needed in our modern society. Now, let's just think about some reasons, practical reasons for prophetic literature. If you think about it, what's one of the questions every child asks as a small child? Mama, Daddy, where did I come from? Children want to know about their history, about their background. When I was a small child, some of my favorite stories that my mother would tell were stories of her childhood, where she had come from and experiences that she had. I wanted to know those things. And here I am 60 odd years later, and I remember those things and I treasure those stories because that's my history too. Well, these prophetic writings from 3,000, 2,500 years ago give us a more complete understanding, a more complete image in our own minds of the ancient world, and especially the Hebrew world. It helps us understand the social and the cultural and the economic circumstances that were common then. You think about the economic situation in that day. They didn't have the kind of industry that we do. They didn't work 8 to 5 jobs. Most people were like our own ancestors in this country. Most people were farmers or shepherds or whatnot. Their lives revolved around the natural world they lived in and revolved around agriculture and so forth. You look at these prophetic books, you understand more fully some of the laws that just on the surface don't make sense to us. Think about this for a minute. One of the hardest things for people in our world today to grasp about Christianity, one of the hardest things for people to actually understand is the death of Jesus. Why did Jesus have to die? And it is the case he had to die in order for us to be forgiven. Well, why is that? Couldn't God just be big enough to get over it and just deal with it, whatnot? People don't understand the concept of guilt and responsibility in our world. But that was very much a part of the ancient world. You have some of the greatest moral and ethical teachings that the world has ever known right here in prophetic literature. And it calls people back. It calls people back to a religious, a moral, a spiritual standard from which we fall, especially God's people. God's word is meant to lead us to a higher moral plane, a higher standard of living. But it also gives us a record of what was going on, why things got as bad as they did, why things were good when they were, how they got from bad back to good. One of the things that we'll see in looking at the kings through Kings and Chronicles is that when the nation divides after Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam becomes king of Israel, king over all 12 tribes, united kingdom. But he doesn't stay king over 12 tribes for very long, because Jeroboam comes along and takes 10 of the 12 tribes. Well, what made that possible? Well, number one, Rehoboam was a fool. Rehoboam listened to foolish counsel. But in that division, what happened? Most of the children of Israel didn't just turn away from Rehoboam, the legitimate king. They also turned away from God, the ultimate king, because Jeroboam turned them to idolatry. So we see that the circumstances that occur in these books, the record that we have, as we see two nations develop out of one, how are these two different? They're two people, two nations, one common language, one common history, and yet what distinguishes the two? Well, these are idolaters, and at least nominally, these are not. But then on top of that, the northern kingdom, the larger, more prosperous kingdom in some ways, look at their kings. 20 some odd kings over the course of their history. And they start out Jeroboam, And what's Jeroboam's biblical epitaph? The thing that is mentioned about him for the rest of the Bible. Jeroboam, who taught Israel to sin. That's how he's known from then on, because he introduced idolatry. God spoke to him through the prophets, said, look, if you'll be faithful, I'll bless you. I'll establish your kingdom. He was more interested in politics than he was in God, and it ended badly for him. And the interesting thing, the comparison between the two, is that in the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, every king is evil. There are no good kings in Israel. In the southern kingdom, in Judah, what you see is a ping pong ball. Good one, bad one, good one, bad one, good one, bad one, bad one, bad one, good one, bad one, good one, good one, bad one, bad one, bad one. They ping pong back and forth, and the people follow along. You see men like Hezekiah and Josiah, Jehoram, that make great reforms and try to straighten things up and turn things around. And how long do their reforms last? Just till they die. And then the people just right back after the next bad king to come along. And so you see a dramatic difference in the character of the two nations. Now, the books of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, what the Hebrews would have called 1st Kings, traced the roots or the origin of the monarchy, the ruling family in Israel. And they show us how that Israel got from judges through Saul to the lineage of the Savior, the house of David. Well, how is it that the very first king of Israel was actually from the tribe of Benjamin instead of the tribe of Judah? And why did God allow 40 years of Saul on the throne? You go back to Genesis chapter 49 and read the prophecies of Jacob concerning his sons, and what he says about Benjamin is not flattering. And what he says about Judah, Judah is the tribe of kings. Judah is a lion's whelp, and the scepter shall not depart from between his feet until Shiloh comes, until the Savior comes. Well, how did they wind up with a Benjaminite king, especially when the book of Judges ends in civil war precipitated by the tribe of Benjamin defending their own people being involved in unrighteousness? Well, 1 Samuel chapter 8 gives the explanation, really. It's not stated in so many words that this is why, but what precipitated the change from judges to kings? You look at 1 Samuel 8, and the elders of Israel come to Samuel, and they say, you're old, and your sons don't walk in your footsteps. Give us a king so we can be just like the nasty, heathen, ungodly, unrighteous, idolatrous nations around us. They didn't put it quite that way, but that was the implication of what they said. They demanded a king. And Saul, the son of Kish of the tribe of Benjamin, is the result when the people do what they want, get what they want. You want a king? All right, here's what he's going to do. He's going to draft your sons into the army. He's going to take your daughters for wives and serving maids and so forth. He's going to tax you into oblivion. He's going to abuse you every way to Sunday and back again. But what did Saul do? Saul started out very humble, but boy, that didn't last long. He did, like you say, he did exactly that. Taxes and an army and drafting the sons and bringing in the daughters and just building himself up. And of course, before long, he got too big for God, and the Spirit of God left him. Here's the kind of king you get when the people get what they demand. God allowed it, and they didn't learn the lesson. That takes us then to David and the household of the Savior, ultimately. Well, as we look at these books, like I said, Samuel's books trace the history, the origin of the monarchy, shows the establishment of the ruling family. And Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, takes up that history from David's last days until Babylonian captivity. Well, Chronicles parallels all of this and more for the post-exile Jews to have really a good understanding of where they are in the world, how they got where they were, and where they're going to wind up. And that's the comparison of the two. The Hebrew title, both for Samuel and for Kings, is simply Kings, because that's the subject. Sometimes it's referred to as kingdoms, because ultimately there's more than one. The northern kingdom had 10 tribes, and is sometimes known not as Israel, but as Ephraim, which is its most numerous and leading tribe. It's interesting. Where did the tribe of Ephraim come from? Exactly. You go back to the original 12 sons, there is no son named Ephraim. There's no son named Manasseh, but there's Joseph, and his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, by Jacob's instruction, inherit in his place. So you have 12 tribes that inherit land. You have 10 of Jacob's sons that inherit land. There is no tribe of Joseph in the land, but there's Ephraim and Manasseh. So you got 12 territories. But wait a minute. There's actually 13 tribes, if you count it that way, aren't there? Because the Levites, they don't inherit territory, they inherit cities and responsibilities, the temple, among others. And they're supposed to be the teachers, but they're scattered throughout the 12 tribes. So it's interesting to think about it that way. Ephraim becomes the centerpiece, really, of the northern kingdom, which is in some ways not really flattering to Joseph, given how faithful he was. The northern kingdom ultimately has 9 dynasties and 20 kings. They're going to last less than 400 years total. The southern kingdom has 1 dynasty, 1 family, David's family. And they also have 20 kings, but they're going to last about 150 years longer than the northern kingdom. And they, unlike the northern kingdom, will be reestablished. Now, let's talk about that reestablishment for just a minute after Babylonian captivity. Jeremiah's message, and we'll get to Jeremiah later on in this semester, because we get down to the time of Josiah. Well, guess what? Jeremiah is related to Josiah, and Jeremiah was very welcome in the palace in Josiah's day. And then Josiah dies, and suddenly Jeremiah is not popular anymore. But Jeremiah's message is, Judah, because of your past sins and your current sins, you're going into captivity, and it's going to last how long? 70 years. His opponents in the court, Shemaiah and Hananiah, said, no, it'll be 2 years and it won't be bad and we'll be back. Well, they were wrong and Jeremiah was right. The nation that comes back from captivity is known as Judah from that time on. But the interesting thing about that is when Cyrus gives the order in 536 to allow the people to go back to Jerusalem, what does the order include? They rebuild the temple, rebuild the city walls, offer sacrifices for Cyrus, by the way. He even gives money to underwrite the expedition, the effort. But his decree also says not just the people of Judah, but any one of Israel, the 10 tribes that wants to go, can go with them. But the nation of Israel as a nation, the northern kingdom, never exists again. Only what we know as the southern kingdom, Judah, is restored. But in that restoration, whatever remnants of Israel wanted to be part of it were allowed to. Israel, the northern kingdom, as I said a while ago, did not have one single righteous king. They were all wicked, just varying degrees of bad. Judah, on the other hand, had 8 kings that either were outright good or at least part of the time were good. And then they had 12 that were not so good. So there's quite a contrast between them. Now, the way these books, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, appear in our Bibles, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, dates not to the Hebrew Bible, but to the Septuagint translations, the Greek translations of the Old Testament that were made during the intertestamental period, from about the year 250 BC, roughly speaking, down to about 150 BC. The Jews, the teachers, the rulers, the priests recognized that more and more and more of their people could not read the scriptures anymore because they did not speak Hebrew. Some of them spoke Aramaic. Those that lived in the land of Palestine spoke Aramaic, which is a dialect of Hebrew, and they could read Hebrew. But Hebrew is a language that doesn't have written vowels. The Hebrew alphabet is 22 consonants. And if you don't know what vowel sounds go with the words, if you can't speak the language, you can't read the language. Now, during this same time, they developed a system of what's called pointing. And Jesus makes reference to that when he talks about not one jot or tittle shall be taken away. And those are words that actually refer to these little marks that the Hebrews introduced to express vowel sounds, A-E-I-O-U, that sort of thing. But most of the Hebrew people, after captivity, did not live in the land of promise. When Cyrus gives the order, all the Jews can go home if they want to, how many went? You have roughly, between Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel, roughly 50,000 that actually went back to reestablish Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and build the city walls. And it took them several decades to accomplish all that. In fact, part of it wasn't finished for nearly 100 years. But the majority of Jewish people wound up doing what Jeremiah told them to do in Jeremiah 29. Jeremiah says, you're going into a strange land. You're going to be there for 3 generations. Pray for the good, pray for the benefit of the city where you are. Settle down, buy a house, buy a farm, get married, have kids, have grandkids. You're going to be there a while. So by the time Cyrus comes along in 536 and says, y'all can go home, we can't go home. Our kids are here. Our grandkids are here. We can't go home. Our grandparents are here. My daddy, my grandma's buried here. Most of the Hebrew people actually stayed put. And over time, scattered out into the Gentile world. In the 1st century, in the Roman Empire, there were colonies or communities of Jews from one side of the empire to the other. And they were recognizable and well known everywhere they were. So most of the Jews after captivity were not living in the land of Palestine, and were not living in a world where they would speak Hebrew or even Aramaic. They were living in a Greek-speaking world, and that was their common language. Where I grew up in Central Texas, there are several little towns just within less than an hour's drive of where I grew up that were originally settled in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s by German settlers from the region of Solms and Braunfels in Germany. And for the last 100 years, since the 1920s, before World War II, German universities in Germany have been sending linguists to study the dialect of German that was spoken in places like Castroville and New Braunfels and Fredericksburg, because that dialect of German has been extinct in Germany for over 100 years. And Central Texas was the only part of the world where that particular dialect was still being spoken commonly. But after World War II, before World War II, if you went to school in Fredericksburg, you probably spoke German at home and went to church and heard the sermon in German and were taught in German in school, because that was, everybody there was German. They were Texans and very proud of it, but they spoke German because that's where they came from. After World War II, the generation that grew up in the 50s grew up speaking German at home, but speaking English in school, learning English when they went to school. And the generation that grew up in the 60s and 70s grew up understanding what Oma and Opa, the grandparents, said when they spoke German at home, but they didn't speak German at home. They grew up speaking English because that's what they spoke at school and that's what their parents had learned in school. And that was the language of commerce and trade. And so now their children, my children's generation, they don't even understand German, most of them, even though they're growing up in historically German communities in Central Texas. Well, the same thing happened to the ancient Jews in the period of the captivity moving forward. As they spread out throughout the world, they lived in places where the language that they had to speak to get by was not Hebrew, but Greek. And Greek, for what it's worth, is a wonderful, ancient Koine Greek is a wonderfully specific, descriptive, exact language. It's a beautiful language, not just to hear it spoken, but to understand how exact and how specific you can be with it. That's why it was the language for the New Testament, because God can give very specific instructions in Greek that people would understand exactly. English, on the other hand, is a vacuum cleaner language, and we pick up words from every language under the sun. You know, everything from kolache, which is a German pastry, to alcohol, which is actually an Arabic word, to chow mein, which is Chinese. We have a vocabulary of roughly 1 million words in the English language. The official French vocabulary is about 50,000 words. A French dictionary is the whole dictionary is about that thick. And the French are very focused on keeping out not French words from their language. Well, English is very ambiguous. If I were to write the word HIT on the whiteboard back here, what would I be talking about? Hit. Well, what does hit mean? Well, it just depends on the context, doesn't it? It can mean to strike, or if it's in baseball, he got a hit. Yay. Or if it's a Broadway play, it's a success. Or if I were a smoker, I'd take a hit. I'd inhale a lungful of poison. So it depends on the context for that one simple little word. English is ambiguous. Greek is not. Greek is very specific for the most part. These people learned not just to get by, but to live their lives in that language. And so during the intertestamental period, to come back around to where I was a few minutes ago, the scholars and the priests of the Hebrew people began to translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And that the result is what we call the Septuagint, or the 70 translators version of the Old Testament. And in that translation, these books of Kings and omissions became 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, basically because it took 2 scrolls for each one. So you had scroll A and scroll B for Samuel, and scroll A and scroll B for Kings, and scroll A and scroll B for Chronicles. And the copies that we have, that was the amount of space that was necessary to write all of this down. And that's how then Jerome, for example, would refer to them as the 1st book of Kings, the 2nd book of Kings, the 1st book of Chronicles, the 2nd book of Chronicles, and so forth. Well, who actually wrote it? Go back to 1st and 2nd Samuel, you can certainly make a case that Samuel was the inspired penman for most, if not all, of what he wrote. Although, if he wrote all of it, he recorded his own death in advance of its happening. And it's possible that that was added by an inspired penman afterward. What about Kings and Chronicles, though? Well, the Talmud says Jeremiah wrote the Baba Batra, which is a Talmudic book, and the Book of Kings and Lamentations. And there are a lot of similarities between what we call 1st and 2nd Kings and the book of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah was a contemporary to the last kings. Jeremiah lived through the reigns of the last 5 kings of Judah, from Josiah till the bitter end, and then on into, actually for him, into captivity in Egypt, basically. But some of the events at the end of 2nd Kings were apparently written by somebody that was in Babylon. Jeremiah was taken to Egypt, according to Jeremiah 43. So you have a different writer there. It may be a contemporary, it could certainly be Daniel or Ezekiel. And that does not take away from its inspiration at all. The release of Jeremiah, Jeremiah was captured when Jerusalem was conquered, and Jeremiah was released in 562, according to 2 Kings chapter 25, verse 27. But the Jews were not permitted to return home for another 30-some years, to 536. So that book, 2 Kings, had to be written sometime between 562 and 536. And you look at 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 41, here's a reference to the book of the words of Solomon. Well, okay, that makes perfect sense in one sense, because who is Solomon? Solomon is a great king. Solomon is a divinely inspired poet and singer and writer. What else did Solomon write? You've got most of the Proverbs, you've got some of the Psalms.
Ecclesiastes.
You've got Ecclesiastes, you've got the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon. You've got a lot that Solomon wrote. So the book of the words of Solomon, we don't know what that is other than a reference in 1 Kings chapter 11, but we know he was a talented and inspired writer. You've got the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah that are mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 14. Now, whether that's our books of Chronicles or something else may be open for debate, but there's also mention there in 1 Kings 14 and again in chapter 15 of the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Now, is that our book of Chronicles? No, because 1st and 2nd Chronicles traces the lineage of David and makes next to no mention of what's going on in the northern kingdom. It's focused on the faithful kingdom. So whatever this book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel is, seems to be either it's an inspired book that we don't have preserved, or it's a secular reference, a historical reference from the northern kingdom. Put all these books together, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles. Include Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, which we'll talk about next semester. The books of Hebrew history. What's the message? If you go back to Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, the whole list of historical books in the Old Testament. What's the lesson? What's the message? You've got 1,000 years roughly of history. And there's one basic message. From Moses all the way to Ezra and Nehemiah, down to the time of Esther in the 400s. 1,000 years, these people never did learn that their fate depended, their prosperity, their happiness, their contentment depended on their observance of the Lord's covenant with them. They never did seem to hang on to the idea that our happiness, our contentment, our blessings depend on our relationship with the Lord. The tone of these historical books is not just dry, dusty history, is it? In fact, if you look at the books of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, this reads almost like a sermon in a way, a historical sermon. And these books are clearly prophetic in their character because they anticipate things yet to come. And they make reference to things that are yet to come. Now, the reign of each king that's recorded here it's not assessed, it's not estimated in the inspired record by his historical impact. Solomon was probably, arguably, the world's first and only trillionaire in terms of wealth. You start tallying up everything that Solomon took in, have mercy, he really could have paved streets with gold. Where did all that go, by the way? Pay attention and you'll figure it out in the conquests that followed. But each king, whether it's Saul or David or Solomon or Rehoboam or Jeroboam or Hezekiah or Josiah or Ahab or Manasseh, good or bad, indifferent, in between, each king is measured in these books not by his political influence or by his military power or the impact he had in history. Each king is measured by his spiritual life. Think about it. What's said at the end of the life of nearly every king here in Kings and Chronicles? They're introduced, and then the end of their story comes and they're concluded. He did that which was what? Right in his own eyes or right in the sight of God. And that's the measure right there. He was good or he was bad spiritually. That was the measure. You look at Azariah or Uzziah, as he's known. He's known by two different names. And we have several kings that are known by more than one name. In fact, you look at Coniah and Jeconiah, they're the same person, but they're known by he's known by different names and different writings. Azariah ruled Judah for 50 years, Uzziah. And he was powerful and prosperous. And his whole story, basically, in Kings, at any rate, is told in 7 verses. 2 Kings 15, verses 1 through 7. You get the whole story right there. That's 50 years. Powerful, prosperous king. And yet his ego got ahead of him somewhere there, and it didn't end well for him. The worth of a life, whether he's a beggar or a king, whether it's a man or a woman, the worth of a life is only measured one way, in its relationship with God. And that's the lesson that we need to take from the books of Kings and Chronicles. Now, the kings of Judah and of Israel, when we get past First Chronicles, and we'll look at First Chronicles in just a rapid fashion, primarily next week. Just go back and just through Saul, David, and Solomon in quick order. There's Otaria Pitt. Let's let her get set. Okay, Sister Pittman, I'm glad to see you here. Hope you haven't been waiting long. I just now saw you on the screen.
Hello.
Hello, glad you're here. Appreciate you being here tonight. These books, the kings of Judah and Israel, are arranged so that they tell the stories of two nations at the same time. Once we get past Solomon, get to Rehoboam and Jeroboam and split the blanket, so to speak, we're telling the stories of two different nations at the same time. And in First and Second Kings particularly, you see the writer jumping back and forth. And it can be a little bit confusing at times because, for one thing, you have two different Jeroboams, not at the same time, mercifully, but you have two different kings named Jeroboam, and you have several names that are very similar, like Jehoram and Joram, and you have men like Azariah, who is also known as Uzziah, and Jeconiah, who's also known as Coniah, and in fact, he's also known as Jehoiada, no, Jehoiakim, I believe. He's got three names in the scriptures, actually. So it can be a little bit disconcerting, a little bit confusing to keep straight who we're talking about at times. And I'll copy you out a chart here in the next week or so that kind of gives a chronology of all of these. It's an old chart. I forget who originally published it, but I think it's in the public domain now, so it should be safe to copy it. But in First and Second Kings, the writer, whoever he is in roughly the same historical period as these kings, as this is being written down. There is a pattern in presenting the information here. He gives an introduction. So-and-so was the son of so-and-so, and he did that which was, good or bad. And then specified events about that individual's life and rulership are laid out. There's an order to this. And you get through his history. Sometimes it's 7 verses like Azariah. Sometimes it's 7 chapters like Ahab. But whether it's a short assessment or a long detailed one, you get to the end, and what comes at the end? Here's the assessment. Here's the verdict. He did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, or he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. God was with him, or God was not with him. And then there's a conclusion, and it takes the same form almost exactly in each case. And that tells us there's an order to this. Now, there are a number of other lessons that come out of this as well. One of the things that stands out in the Kings is that you can count on one hand the number of kings that had one wife. You go back to Genesis chapter 2, and how many wives did God make for Adam? God made Eve, not Steve, and not Nancy or Sally or Sue. He made Adam one woman to be an help meet for him, a companion to answer his needs, his shortcomings. One man for one woman for life. Jesus was asked about that in Matthew 19. And what did he say in verse 8? Have you not read? This is God's design. He pointed them back to the Garden of Eden. And yet, what do you see in almost all the kings? polygamy. And not just 2 or 3, but a whole house full, a harem. It's never commanded. It was practiced all throughout the Old Testament period, and it didn't start with the kings. But it's never commanded. It's never encouraged. It's just recorded as a historical fact. And one of the interesting things is that the scriptures go to great lengths to show us again and again and again the headaches and the heartaches that result from turning aside from God's design. You look at Genesis chapter 21, and Esau marries 2 women and then later on marries a third. And what's the summary of his multiple marriages as far as his mother and daddy are concerned? They were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. You look at 1 Samuel chapter 1. Here's Elkanah, who seems to be a Levite, a priest. And he's got Hannah, who is probably close to his age, and then she's barren. And here's Peninnah, who maybe is younger, but fertile and has a whole raft of kids and just rubs Hannah's nose in it left and right until finally God gives her not just Samuel, but a half dozen kids ultimately, and she's vindicated. But look at the heartache that the woman endured and the stress it caused for her husband, for her to be unhappy. And can you imagine how hard it must have been for him to deal with Peninnah over here, trying to find ways to dig on Hannah, all living in the same house, as it were. You look at 2 Samuel chapter 11, same kind of thing going on. So in Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 17, way back there, when Moses is restating, what is the book of Deuteronomy? Deuteronomy is sometimes described as a 30-day revival. It's the name as we have it, Deutero and nomos is a compound word, Deutero meaning second and nomos meaning law. It's a repetition of everything that was given in the book of Exodus, in the law, the 10 commandments and the application of them and so forth, the instructions. And why does Moses do this? This takes place at the boundary of the promised land, because finally that slave generation, the faithless generation, has died out in the wilderness. And now the new generation, with Joshua as their leader and Caleb as a prominent general, the only 2 faithful of that previous generation, now they're about to go in and possess the promised land. And they need to be reminded, here's the covenant God made with you. Here's the law that God gave to you. Now you sit up and pay attention. And what do we find in Deuteronomy 17 and verse 17? There's an instruction about kings. Well, wait a minute, we don't have a king. God is our king. Yeah, but what does that tell them prophetically? Your kids are going to come to a point, your descendants are going to come to a point where they're going to want an earthly king. And when they do, here's the law about that. Not supposed to take a bunch of wives. What's the very first thing that they did? Man, they started marrying left and right. Even David. Solomon's polygamy was the beginning of the end for a united Israel, because what did Solomon's polygamy do to him? There you go. It introduced idolatry into his heart, into his life. God's original ideal for marriage, his original standard, one man, one woman for life. And when we set that aside, now sometimes we don't have any control over that. You know, there are accidents, there are deaths. Sometimes one turns aside and the other one is faithful. Sometimes we don't have any control over that. The ideal, though, is one man for one woman for life. And when we set that aside, the result is disaster. Every time. think about all the implications just as we go through looking at these kings. Think about all the impact that all their marriages and their relationships have. Just look at David, for example. Here's a man with Michal, and then she winds up being given by her father to another man, Palti, and he's married to Abigail and Maacah. I think he winds up with a whole house full of wives, and then he gets Michal back. But then what does he do on top of all of that? Oh, there's Bathsheba. Boy, she's pretty. Never mind that she's married to one of my most faithful, loyal subjects. And he just takes her. He then marries her, but mainly to try to conceal what he'd done. It never works out well. And what happened to his children? One of his sons tried to kill him. One of his sons murdered another son. One of his sons raped a sister. Just nothing good comes from it. Nothing good comes from deviating from God's plan. The great thought in these books, the unifying thread, you might say, is that this biblical history shows very clearly, very firmly, the idea that God is the ultimate controlling power, and sin is the disturbing force in our lives, in the universe, in history, both individually and in nations. Basically, God is the only final opinion that matters. And one of the things that we see here is that the forgiveness of sins does not take away their consequences. Well, it is 7:42, so we need to take about a 13-minute break, and we will reconvene at 10 till 8 and go on from there. Questions or comments before we break? Well, folks online can turn your cameras on like Brother Sam if you want.
I'll look awful. I'll put it on next week.
You're not going to show off. We're not going to do that.
Recently reminded that
All right. Now you're going to want to take your Bible and turn to the book of First Chronicles. And we're going to be looking now at basically kind of survey through the first 10 chapters of First Chronicles. And this, like everything else tonight, and basically next week too, this is background to the actual study of the Kings through Kings and Chronicles. And as we said, this First and Second Chronicles, originally one book, and this record, unlike Samuel and Kings, this record was written sometime after captivity. So this is a post-captivity record, and it focuses on the history of Judah. So when we go back to Adam here in verse 1, we're going to end up in the kingdom of Judah. And this is for the post-exile Jews. The two books of Chronicles basically are, this is your national and spiritual history book. That's what how this is presented. This is their record of where they came from. There's a lot of emphasis on David and Solomon. In fact, in the two books combined, David occupies probably a quarter of the whole space, or maybe a little more, maybe a third of the whole volume, and Solomon a big portion as well. Well, that stands to reason if you're a post-exile Jew, especially in Judah, but anywhere in the world for that matter, because in your history, who's the greatest king of all time? That's going to be David. And close second is going to be Solomon, even though Solomon maybe didn't end up so good compared to David. The nation was greater and more prosperous under Solomon than it was under David in a lot of ways. More territory in their boundaries, and certainly more wealth. So that's the high point of their history. So there's going to be a lot of focus there. Plus, you think about it, that's the dynasty of their nation. That's the house of David. Bethlehem comes down to us into the New Testament as what? That's the city of David. And then Jerusalem. David moves the capital to Jerusalem. Saul did not reign in Jerusalem. David establishes Jerusalem as the capital. Now, as you look at First Chronicles, one of the things that we have to take into account is that the people that would be reading this from the very beginning, from the time that it's being written, it's history for them. It's not happening during their lifetimes. The writer is not writing it during the events that he's recording. He's recording history for the benefit of people to look back. And one of the things that this does for them by reviewing their history and pointing out lessons, as the writer of Chronicles does, is to reassure them that even as they look back at the bad things in their history and the bad experiences, captivity, conquest, suffering, and unrighteousness by their leadership, God is always faithful through all of this. God is always consistent. And that's one thing that stands out. The most common, there are a lot of different opinions about who the inspired writer of the books of Chronicles was, and there are various candidates, Jeremiah and Baruch and others. Jewish tradition, and there's no reason to argue with it, Jewish tradition says that these books were compiled by Ezra the prophet, and Ezra the leader of people. And that would certainly make sense because he is a prominent individual, a prominent leader. He lives during that time immediately after captivity. He was in a place, in a situation where he would be very, very aware of his people's need for these lessons, his people's need for this history, and for them to see what they came out of in captivity. Well, they brought it on themselves and they suffered through it, but God kept his word and restored them just like he promised he would. And so if it is Ezra, no reason to believe that it's not, he's living right there where they most need these lessons, where they most need this information to remind them. So you start in chapter 1. Well, where does Ezra go? All the way back to the beginning. Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Japheth. And he begins to break out from Noah forward the individual families, the sons of Japheth, the sons of Ham, and Cush fathered Nimrod, the first man on earth to be a mighty man, the English Standard Version says there, or as the footnote says here, he was first to be mighty on the earth. Now, you come in here at verse 11. Egypt is not the nation Egypt, but an individual named Egypt, fathered Ludim, Anamim, and so on. And we get down to Canaan. Canaan fathered Sidon, his firstborn, and Heth, and the Jebusites, and the Amorites, and the Girgashites, and the Hivites. Well, all of these people develop into nations that become neighbors and enemies and corruptors of Israel. And yet they all share a common background, don't they? They all trace back ultimately to Adam, but you don't even have to go all the way back to Adam, because where does the lineage bottleneck? Well, long before David, it bottlenecks at Noah, because you just stop and think a minute. From Adam to Noah, you have these extraordinarily long lives. Here's Methuselah. How long did Methuselah live? 960, almost a millennium. And there is absolutely no reason for us to suppose, well, they didn't know how to count time, then that's probably months, not years, as some of the modern skeptics do. There's no reason to assume that they did not know how to count years and that he did not live that long. If he did, when did Methuselah die? Yeah, Methuselah died, may have drowned in the flood. He died the year of the flood, but these extraordinarily long-lived people. And how many people were in the world prior to the flood? I don't know. It may have been millions. It may have been billions. I mean, you think about it, a man that lives hundreds of years and has children over several hundred years, and his children have children, his children's children, and so on and so on. My goodness, how many generations of Methuselah's descendants were in the world as adults having children of their own before he died? And think about, some of these people could go back and say, you know, Father Adam, tell us what it was like in the garden. You know, great granddaddy Adam, what was it like to get thrown out of the garden? Boy, that's a dumb question. Look at the misery around you. But they all bottleneck in Noah. However many people were in the world, we get down to Noah, here's 8 souls. And really, in one sense, we might even be so bold as to say only one righteous soul. We don't know about Ham and Shem and Japheth and their wives and Mrs. Noah. There's not really much of an assessment given of their spirituality and faithfulness. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and 8 people were saved, and everybody bottlenecks back to him. All of these people that became the nations that fought amongst themselves and hated one another and worshiped idols and troubled Israel, they're all related. We all come from common ancestors. So you have this record that brings us from Adam through Noah and his descendants down to verse 24 to Shem and Arphaxad and Shelah and Eber and Peleg and Reu and Serug and Nahor and Terah and Abram, that is Abraham. So we go in the space of 26 verses from Adam through Noah to Abraham. Well, that's just a thumbnail sketch. And in many respects, if you have Genesis through Deuteronomy, you've got all of that and more. Actually, if you've just got the book of Genesis, you've got all of that. But this is a thumbnail sketch of it. And now at verse 27, verse 28 rather, we start in with the sons of Abraham. Well, now, why would we begin to zero in at this point? For Judah, this is the beginning of their identification as a nation. Come down to the days of Jesus, and Jesus, being acclaimed by the people, is scolded by the Pharisees because the people are acclaiming him as the Son of God, and they don't want, the Pharisees don't want him to accept that. And how does he reply? Why, if I tell them to hush, the very rocks would cry out. And they say, well, we have Abraham as our father, and we've never been in bondage to any man, which was a lie on both parts. In one respect, It was a lie that they had never been in bondage. They had been in bondage again and again and again. Can you say Egypt? Can you say Babylon? Can you say Rome? But on top of that, and here's what Jesus points out to them, if Abraham was really your father, you would believe in me, because Abraham looked forward to my day. Well, Abraham is, in their minds, is the genesis of their national identity, even though that's not going to come for basically 500 years after Abraham. The covenant goes back to him. Abraham's sons, Isaac and Ishmael, even though they're born in the reverse order. Isaac is the son of the promise. He's the firstborn, even though he's not the first one born. And Ishmael, the son of the bondwoman, and their genealogies. And now here, notice what you have here. Ishmael's descendants: Nebaioth, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishma, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jeter, Naphish, Kedemah, the sons of Ishmael. What did God promise to Hagar about Ishmael when she took him and ran away? He would be the father of many nations. Well, my goodness, he had a whole passel of kids, didn't he? So God kept that promise. And these are people that the children of Israel could identify in their descendants. But it doesn't stop there. There's more to come. Sarah dies, and what does old 100-and-something-year-old Abraham do? Well, I don't know how old Keturah was, but she was young enough. She had a bunch of kids too. The sons of Keturah, Abraham's concubine, secondary wife, and in that circumstance, concubine is not, don't mistake that word concubine as being like a prostitute or a slave. It's simply a level of status where her role in the household is less than that of the first wife. Her relationship and her children don't inherit on the same level as the first wife's children. Think of Bilhah and Zilpah in Jacob's household. Now, all of Jacob's sons basically inherit equally, don't they? But Bilhah and Zilpah are not on the same relationship as Rachel and Leah, because Jacob married them, and then Bilhah and Zilpah, they were married to him. He didn't marry them, as it were. He didn't say, I want them. That's, here, take them. You know, we get into that rivalry of more than one wife. Brother Andrew Conley, who did mission work in what was then, back in the 60s, Tanganyika, I think it's Tanzania now, predominantly Muslim country, where polygamy is practiced among the Muslims, often made the comment that if you want to see the most miserable creature on earth, find a Muslim man that's actually married to 4 wives at the same time, just like Sharia law allows. Because in that household, ain't nobody happy. Because every wife wants to be number one. And so they're all jockeying amongst themselves, and they all take it out on the husband. Well, imagine what it must have been like for Jacob. Well, Abraham has all of these other sons, the sons of Keturah, Zimran, Yokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, Shua, and then their children, their descendants, and so forth. Abraham, here's the money quote down here at verse 34. As far as Judah is concerned, Abraham fathered Isaac. All of that's just ancillary history to them, but it's important because, number one, these are people, their descendants, that they have to deal with. Their descendants over the centuries, they impact each other, and they fight and squabble with each other, and they make alliances with each other, and sometimes they even intermarry with each other. Here's Ruth, is a Moabite woman, and she's in the lineage of the Savior. But not only Ruth, go back 2 generations, who is Boaz's mother. Mm-hmm. No, not Bathsheba. We're back on the backside of that. Boaz's mother.
Rahab.
Rahab. There you go. And Rahab is not an Israelite. Rahab is from Jericho. Yeah. So she's a Canaanite woman. So the point in all of this early background history is these are people that Israel is still related to. Judah is still related to these people, even if it's distantly. And they were part of God's purpose, God's plan as well. But we get down here, Abraham fathered Isaac, Isaac fathered Esau and Israel, or Jacob, and the sons of Esau. Well, how does Esau figure into this? Well, who is Esau in the days of the nation of Israel?
Moab?
No, well.
Oh, no,
Way,
Edomite, Edom.
and the interesting thing about the Edomites, they're descended from Esau. Look at the sons that are mentioned here. The sons of Esau: Eliphaz, Reuel, Yeush, Yalam, and Korah, and then their sons, and so on and so forth. But we get down here, the sons of Seir in verse 38, Lotan and Shobal and so forth, and the sons of Lotan. These are going to bring us on down to the folks that become the nation of Edom. And Edom as a nation, what's their relationship with Judah? It is not good. You're right.
God expects them to be kind to Judah, but they're not.
You're
When
right.
When the Israelites capture the land of Canaan, they cause them problems all along.
That's right. When the Babylonians invade, the Edomites catch fleeing Jews and kick them back. It's kind of catch and release into the custody of the Babylonians. They're not treating them like brethren, like kinfolks. They're treating them like strangers. And Obadiah takes them to task for that and prophesies their downfall because of that. But here's the curious thing. Of all the nations that Jeremiah prophesies against, the foreign nations that are going to be destroyed and not rise again, where's Edom in that? Edom is not obliterated because come down to the intertestamental period, the period after captivity down to the time of Christ, we don't see the Edomites in the New Testament as Edomites, but they're there. At that point, they're known as Idumeans, Idumean. And guess who the biggest Idumean of all was? Herod the Great. Herod's father and Herod's generation were those formerly known as Edomites, now known as Idumeans, who were conquered by the Jews under the Maccabee rulers, the priestly rulers, and forced to convert to Judaism at sword point. And Herod, being of the royal house of Idumea, marries a Jewish princess and winds up, with Roman help, becoming king of the Jews. So the role of the Edomites, even at this point in Judah's history, where Ezra or whoever is writing down this history for their benefit, they're not done with the Edomites yet, because the Edomites, through Herod, have a role to play right down to the time of the Messiah. So the Jews need to know who these people are, where they come from, and who they're becoming as time goes by. Now you get down to verse 43. These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the people of Israel. Bela, the son of Beor, or Balak, perhaps, the son of Beor, the name of his city being Dinhaba. Bela died, and Jobah, the son of Zerah of Bozrah, reigned in his place. Jobah died, and Husham of the land of the Temanites. Oh, hold on a minute. Where have we heard that word Temanite before? Go back to what is probably the first book of the Bible actually written down before Moses ever came along. that would be the book of Job. And Eliphaz, one of Job's friends, is described as what? Eliphaz the Temanite. So the Temanite, Husham of the land of the Temanites reigned in his place. Husham died. Hadad, the son of Bedad, who defeated Midian in the country of Moab, reigned in his place, the name of his city being Avith. Hadad died, and Samlah of Masrekah reigned in his place. Samlah died, and Shaul of Rehoboth on the Euphrates reigned in his place. Shaul died. Baal-Hanan, the son of Achbor, reigned in his place. One of the things that stands out is that these guys are not father, son, father, son, father, son. These guys are new dynasty every generation, it seems. Whoever's the strong man of this era becomes king. Whoever has the oomph to rule. And we get down to the chiefs of Edom. The chiefs were Timnah and Alva and Yetheth and Oholibamah and Elah and Pinon and Kenaz and Teman and so forth. Chiefs of Edom. And all of this is history of the people that somebody has, I think that's Rex coming in. All of these are people that Israel has to deal with, has to cope with, and ought to try to maintain good relations with, but doesn't always. So now we come to chapter 2 in 1 Chronicles. And here's where we get down to the genealogy of David. And from the Jews' point of view, this is where things get really thrilling and exciting, because now they're not talking about ancient history, all those people long gone. Now they're talking about their people as they would think of it. The sons of Israel. And we have all 12. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Joseph, Benjamin, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, and then the sons of Judah, Onan, and Shelah. These three, Bathshua the Canaanite bore to him. Judah's firstborn, was evil, and the Lord put him to death. His daughter-in-law Tamar also bore him Perez and Zerah. Judah had 5 sons in all. And the sons of Perez, Hezron and Hamul. The sons of Zerah, Zimri and Ethan, Heman, Calcol, Dara, 5 in all. Why do these matter?
They're all in the lineage of Christ.
Bingo. The lineage of Christ runs through Judah. Now, not all of these are the lineage of Christ, but one of them is. One of these sons is the son of Carmi, Achan, the troubler of Israel. Oh, guess what? The guy that caused all that trouble at Jericho and Ai is kinfolks to the Lord himself. Way back there. Maybe not an ancestor, obviously, because Achan and all of his were stoned, but he was related nonetheless. And Ethan's son was Azariah. And the sons of Hezron that were born to him, Jeremiel, Ram, Chelubai. Ram fathered Aminadab. I'm going to get my tongue tangled up here in a minute. And Aminadab fathered Nahshon, prince of the sons of Judah. And Nahshon fathered Salmon, and Salmon fathered Boaz, and Boaz fathered Obed, and Obed fathered Jesse. And who was Jesse's son? David, along with Eliab and 5 others in between. And on we go down through this. We get to David. Abigail bore Amasa, and the father of Amasa was Jether the Ishmaelite. Caleb, the son of Hezron, fathered children by his wife Azubah, and on down through here. All of these people enter into the environment that created the nation. Now, at this point, the inspired writer is still back in what for these Israelites, these Jews, was ancient history before the kingdom is established. We haven't even come to David as the king. We've just got his lineage laid out here. And the rest of this, after Hezron went into Machir, the daughter of Machir, the father of Gilead, and so forth. We have all of the detail here. going through this lineage, these are people that the children of Judah would recognize in their own lineages, in their own families. That's my great, 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 great 19 times removed grandfather or ancestor or whoever. That's, Maacah, that's the father of my 21 times removed grandmother or whatever. And these are the families and the lineages that the post-exilic Jews would trace their families back to in large measure. So come down here to chapter 3, and I don't mean to give short shrift to this by any means, but this is history that is before the main focus of our study in this course. Come down to chapter 3, and now we have David's sons. Now we come down to the time of the king, the great king, David. Sons born in Hebron: Amnon by Ahinoam the Jezreelite, Daniel by Abigail the Carmelite, Absalom, whose mother was Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur, Adonijah, whose mother was Haggith, Shephatiah by Abital, Ithream by Eglah, 6 born in Hebron, where he reigned 7 years and 6 months. He reigned 33 years in Jerusalem. These were born to him in Jerusalem: Shemaiah, Shobab, Nathan, and Solomon. 4 by Bathshua, the daughter of Amiel, or Bathsheba, as it's may be known here. Then Ibhar, Elishama, Eliphalet, Noga, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, another Elishama, Eliada, Eliphalet, another Eliphalet, 9 David's sons, besides the sons of the concubines, and Tamar was their sister. So he got a house full. No wonder he had to be king and have a good income. He got a big family to support. But that brings us then to Solomon. And again, all of this is their national identity. These are people, at the time that this is being written, these are people who no longer have a king. They have a royal family. They know who, in theory, could be king, but by the same token, the whole nation of Judah, all the men, in some degree, would have a claim on the throne, wouldn't they? Think about the English royal family, the royal family in the UK. You've got the Queen on the throne now, 95 years old, and seemingly determined to hang on until Charles dies of corruption and old age, so she doesn't have to deal with her own good-for-nothing son. And then she can hand it off to Harry. But in the meantime, behind Harry, or William. But behind William is the redhead that's married to the actress who hadn't got any, apparently it doesn't have any good sense. That's Harry, I think. And even though he has renounced his income and all that, still he's in line, but he's not next in line anymore because William's got sons. So he just got demoted. So his claim to the throne went from being third in line after the Queen to being about 6th in line after the Queen and Charles and William and whatever his sons' names are, and daughters, because daughters can be queen now. So he's been bumped down from 3rd to about 6th or 7th. Well, all of these people for whom this is being written, all of the Jews of the tribe of Judah, in a sense, they all have an attachment to the throne because they're all descendants of the royal tribe. But at this point in time, there's no king. Who was the last king that actually ruled in Jerusalem?
it started with a Z. Was it Zerubbabel?
No, it's Zechariah. Zerubbabel
Zechariah,
was one of
okay.
the restorers after captivity. Zechariah was the last king who actually ruled on the throne in Jerusalem. And go back just a couple of kings from him, not actually generations, because his predecessors were actually his brothers, not his father. Go back to Jeconiah, or Coniah, as he's known in Jeremiah's writings, and what is said of Coniah in Jeremiah 22. Write this man childless, no descendant of his shall prosper, ruling on the throne of David his father in Jerusalem. But then jump forward to Matthew chapter 21, and guess who pops up in the lineage of Jesus? Jeconiah. So Jeremiah's prophecy, write this man childless, doesn't mean the man had no children. That word actually expresses the idea of desolation or being, in a sense, abandoned, though he was not abandoned by God. And he lost his position. He's taken away captive into Babylon or into Assyria. I'm about to get the two, which king went where? I'm about to get confused. I think he went to Syria and then to Babylon. But at any rate, the statement is, none of his descendants shall prosper ruling in Jerusalem. By the way, here's you a freebie. That tells you that your premillennial friends that are looking for the Lord to come back and establish a kingdom and reign in Jerusalem, they don't know what they're talking about, because Jesus can't do that because he's a descendant of that king. So either Jeremiah lied and the Holy Spirit was wrong if Jesus does that, or the premillennial folks are wrong and Jesus will never reign in Jerusalem on an earthly throne. Well, I'm going to put my money on the premillennial folks being wrong. Well, come back over here. These people, after captivity, are being shown you've had kings for these 500 years leading up to captivity, and what did it get you? It got you captivity. It got you the sorry diminished state that you're in here. You have the mighty King David. He's followed by Solomon. The son of Solomon was Rehoboam. Abijah was his son. Asa was his son. Jehoshaphat was his son. Joram, Ahaziah, Joash, Amaziah, Azariah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Ammon, Josiah, the sons of Josiah, Johanan, Jehoiakim, Zedekiah, Shallum, the descendants of Jehoiakim, Jeconiah, Zedekiah his son, the sons of Jeconiah the captive, Shealtiel. Hello, there's the Savior's lineage. Malchiram, Pedaiah, Shenazar, Jechamiah, Hoshama, and Nebadiah. And the sons of Pedaiah, Zerubbabel, and Shemaiah, the sons of Zerubbabel, Meshullam, and Hananiah, and Shalomith was their sister. And Hashubah, Ohel, Berechiah, Hasadiah, and Jushabesed, and so on and so on and so on. What he's doing is he's bringing them down now to their own time. You want to trace out the royal family? All right, here are the families that the lineage goes through. Yes, the whole nation, in a sense, is the royal family, but here's the specific lineage, and here are these descendants. You can pick these descendants out. Oh, and by the way, they're not sitting on the throne, are they? So you come down to chapter 4. And chapter 4 actually jumps backwards in a sense. The sons of Judah, Perez, Hezron, Carmi, Hur, and Shobal. And what are we doing? We're looking now at the building of the nation in history. So we've established the lineage for these people. Here's how you get from Adam to us, as far as the captives that have come back in the post-exile days. Here's how you get from the beginning to where they are. And here's how they came into existence. Now here's national history in chapters 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and so forth. The descendants of Judah, and they start with the firstborn. Now, Judah's not the first one born, but what did Jacob do in Genesis chapter 49? Jacob appointed him to be the firstborn. And there's a reason that he's listed in this order. He's the fourth son born. But firstborn, that expression has nothing to do with order of birth. It has to do with the position that he occupies in the family. And he becomes the head patriarch after Jacob. Reuben is disqualified because he messed around with Bilhah. Simeon and Levi are disqualified because they murdered the Shechemites, led in the murder of the Shechemites. Judah is then the one who is elevated to that position of being the next head of the family, the next ultimate patriarch. And he becomes the tribe of the kings. So here we start with Judah, and then we'll come around to Simeon and Reuben and so forth. And ultimately, we'll get to Levi over here. And Levi stands out from all of the other tribes because Levi is what? Levi is the priestly tribe. They're not a territorial tribe at all. They get 48 cities and a job instead of a big piece of territory. So we'll get to Levi. But here in chapter 4, we have the descendants of Judah listed out. Perez, Ezron, Carmi, Hur, Shobal, Reiah, the son of Shobal, fathered Jahath, and Jahath fathered Ahumai and Lahad, the clans of the Zorathites, and so forth. And these are the sons of Hur, the firstborn of Ephrathah, the father of Bethlehem, and so forth and so on, down through these. And you get down here to this interesting character at verse 9. Jabez, or Jabez, as we usually pronounce it. Jabez was more honorable than his brothers. His mother called his name Jabez, saying, because I bore him in pain. Named the kid, you hurt me. That's what it amounts to. But now, look at verse 10. Jabez called upon the God of Israel, saying, oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my border, that your hand might be with me, that you would keep me from harm, so that it might not bring me pain. And God granted what he asked. And I forget the guy's name, wrote a whole book about the prayer of Jabez. It was really popular here about 15 years ago, and completely took this out of context to make this into something that it was not. This is simply a historical record of the fact that this man was a godly man, and God granted his prayer. This is not a prescription for health and wealth in our lives, but it is an example of a godly man humbling himself before the Lord. That brings us to Caleb, the brother of Shuha, and so forth, down through here. I'm not going to go into detail on all of these different names and individuals, in part because time doesn't permit it. But as we go through here, keep in mind that particularly here in chapter 4 with the sons of Judah, the people that are reading these words, like I said, would look back and say, hey, that's my family. Well, that's your family. These are your ancestors. These are my ancestors. Hey, we're related through this one or that one, going back to that ancient time. You get a little detail down here at verse 23. These, Joachim and the men of Kozeba and Joash and Saraph, who ruled in Moab and turned to Lechem, or as it may be, Yashubim. These were the potters who were inhabitants of Netayim and Gedara. They lived there in the king's service. Well, that doesn't mean a lot to us necessarily, but to these people, they could identify these locations. And they would recognize the ruins of places here and so forth. The potter's site where they would gather clay and throw pots and fire them and so forth. Well, that brings us over to the descendants of Simeon in chapter 4. You pick up at verse 24, the descendants of Simeon, Nemuel, Yamin, Yarib, Zerah, Shaul, Shalom was his son, Mibsam his son, Mishma his son, and so forth and so on. Shimei had 16 sons and 6 daughters, but his brothers did not have many children, nor did all their clan multiply like the men of Judah. Well, there's a comparison there, just as they survey themselves, as the Jews, as the Hebrews, not just the Jews, but all 12 tribes scattered throughout the ancient world, as they interact with each other. Some tribes are big and some tribes are not. Ephraim was far and away the most prosperous and numerous tribe for much of the nation's histories. But Judah, standing alone, oftentimes musters as many fighting men on their own, or nearly as many, as the whole rest of the nation combined. So they become a very numerous, prosperous people in their own right. Simeon, on the other hand, Simeon is a neighbor to Judah geographically, but they have comparatively small territory and they don't muster a whole lot of people by comparison. Well, here's one of the reasons you don't find a lot of Simeonites in this time. They didn't have a lot of children. Shimei was prolific, had 22 children. Now, I don't know that they were all but one wife, 16 sons and 6 daughters, but he had a lot of descendants. You have territory here. Their villages, verse 32, were Etam and Ain and Rimmon and Token and Esham, 5 cities along with their villages. Well, what's significant about these? Those are places that David frequented. David went to Rimmon at times and so forth. Go back one verse. These were their cities, these others, until the time of David, until David reigned, and then they were just basically glommed into Judah at that point. At one point, they had a lot of territory, but they did not hold on to it. Now, go down to about verse 34, and you have a whole list of names, and the point comes in at verse 38. These mentioned by name were princes in their clans. Their fathers' houses increased greatly. They journeyed to the entrance of Gedor, to the east side of the valley, to seek pasture for their flocks. They found good, rich pasture. They prospered. Registered by name, they came in the days of Hezekiah, the king of Judah. And what happened? Were destroyed. Some of them, 500 men, verse 42, of the Simeonites went to Mount Seir. Well, wait a minute. Where's Mount Seir? Mount Seir is Edomite territory. The descendants of Esau, they're kinfolks, but they're idol-worshiping kinfolks. They're folks that are not a good influence on the people of Israel. They went to Mount Seir, having as their leaders Pelatiah, Neariah, Raphiah, Uzziel, the sons of Ishi, and they defeated the remnant of the Amalekites who had escaped, and they lived there to this day. So the inspired writer is telling the Hebrew people, look, some of your kinfolks have been living over here among the Edomites even till now, all the way from the time of David fall, for hundreds of years. Some of these people, some of these Hebrew people, haven't been too strongly attached to their territory, to their God, to their faith. And that's an aspect, a frequent characteristic in the history of the Hebrew people. Come on into chapter 5, and you have the descendants of Reuben. Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, he was the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's couch, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel, so that he could not be enrolled as the oldest son, though Judah became strong among his brothers and a chief came from him, yet the birthright belonged to Joseph. The sons of Reuben, and here you go through all of this, and notice one of the things that stands out here is that you have this list of names. You have this genealogy come down here, the sons of Joel, Shemaiah his son, Gog his son, Shemaiah his son, Micah his son, Reiah his son, Baal his son, Bera, whom Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, carried away into exile, a chief among the Reubenites, and his kinsmen by their clans, when the genealogy of their generations was recorded, and so forth. But these are folks, where are they? Geographically, they're far away. They're Transjordanic tribes. They're over there close to the heathens in the first place. And they're among the first ones to be carried into captivity by the Assyrians. Notice down here at verse 9, this descendant also lived to the east as far as the entrance of the desert, this side of the Euphrates, because their livestock had multiplied in the land of Gilead. In the days of Saul, they waged war against the Hagrites, who fell into their hand, and they lived in their tents through all the regions east of Gilead. So in the days of Saul, they had prospered, but you don't hear much about them after that until we get here. They don't play a prominent role much after that.
Brother Dave, do you have time for a question?
Yes, I do, certainly. I won't guarantee that I have an answer.
Okay, chapter 5,
Yes, ma'am.
verse 2,
Yes, ma'am.
the parenthetical statement about Judah was strong among his brothers, and a chief came from him. The birthright belonged to Joseph,
Yes.
and the was that birthright? Seems like I remember something about a double portion. Was that Ephraim and Manasseh? Is that why they each had a?
I would think so, yes. If you go back to Genesis chapter 49, you have Jacob's blessing of the sons there. Let me stick a marker in here. And he runs through the sons in order and comes to Joseph. And notice what he says down here at verse 22. Joseph is a fruitful bough by a spring. His branches run over the wall. The archers bitterly attacked him, shot at him, harassed him severely. Yet his bow remained unmoved. His arms were made agile by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. From there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Well, how so? From there is the shepherd. By the God of your fathers who will help you, by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that crouches beneath, blessings of the breast and the womb. The blessings of your father are mighty beyond the blessings of my parents, up to the bounties of the everlasting hills. May they be on the head of Joseph and on the brow of him who was set apart from his brothers. So you have this extensive statement about Joseph and the notation, he's set apart from his brothers. Well, not by his own design, not even by his father's design initially, but by the Lord's design. Now, you back up and you have Jacob in chapter 48 blessing Ephraim and Manasseh. And what does he do there?
He switches them.
He reverses hands on the boys to bless the younger over the older. And Joseph tries to correct that. And Jacob was having none of it. But notice what he says here. That is that these will inherit, basically says these will inherit in your place. So in essence, Joseph as a tribe, as a single tribe, doesn't exist. But what exists in his place? Two tribes, a double portion. So in that sense, you do have a firstborn portion given to Joseph that normally would have belonged to Reuben in dollars and cents terms, you might say.
Given to Joseph or given to Judah?
Judah assumes the position of firstborn, but
right.
In terms in I guess you'd say in dollars and cents terms, in terms of the inheritance, it's Joseph who receives the double portion, which would normally be the firstborn's material inheritance, because both of his sons inherit.
Okay.
That's what the inspired writer is referring to here in chapter 5, Judah becomes the strong chief, becomes the king, the firstborn in authority. Joseph receives the inheritance, the material inheritance of the first.
Okay.
So that brings us then to Gad. They lived over against them in the land of Bashan as far as Salakah. We have Transjordanic, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh over there on the east side of the Jordan. Come down here to chapter 5, and I need a Bible that has larger numbers in it. Verse 18, the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh had valiant men who carried shield and sword, drew the bow, expert in war, almost 45,000, 44,760, able to go to war, waged war against the Hagrites, Yeder, Nephish, and Noda, and prevailed over them, and so forth. Carried off all their livestock, 50,000 camels, 250,000 sheep, 2,000 donkeys, 100,000 men alive. Many fell because the war was of God, and they lived in their place until the exile. Well, you have details that for the majority of the people reading this in the time that it is written, the majority of the people reading it, it would be just basically details. The focus here is on Judah. Now, how many of the Hebrews outside of Judah would maintain their identity, maintain contact with their culture, their history, their background, and ultimately their religion? Percentage-wise, we really don't know. We come down to the New Testament, we have Saul of Tarsus, who is of the tribe of what? He's not a Jew. He's a Jew religiously, but as far as the nation is concerned, he's of the tribe of Benjamin. And we find a few others in the New Testament that are singled out. They're Israelites, and religiously they would be called Jews, but they're not necessarily of the tribe of Judah itself. Now, one thing to bear in mind, and it can be a little confusing at times. We use the word Jew and the word Israelite interchangeably, pretty much in our minds. In our minds, as we think of it, as we go through the New Testament particularly, we tend to think of anybody descended from Abraham through Isaac and Jacob, all of Jacob's children, as Jews. And when you come down to the intertestamental period and the New Testament time of Christ and the apostles, religiously speaking, yes, they are Jews. And in the culture of the Gentile world of that period, that's how they were described. They were described as Jews because of their religion. However, in the Old Testament, we need to make the distinction that all Jews are Hebrews or Israelites, but not all Israelites, not all Hebrews are Jews, because you've got 12 other tribes, if you count the Levites, besides the tribe of Judah. And so in the Old Testament, Jew is a fairly rare word, but it typically describes someone of the tribe of Judah rather than someone who is religiously Jewish, which would encompass all of the tribes in theory. So we get down here, we look at the descendants of Gad and the descendants of the Reubenites, the Gadites, and part of Manasseh. At verse 25, you've got the half tribe of Manasseh that lived in the promised land from Bashan to Baal Hermon and so forth. Remember that Manasseh was divided half in, half out, so to speak. And this is the record of those who were in. And then chapter 6, we come to the Levites. And the Levites are exceptional. The sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, Merari, the priestly families. The sons of Kohath, the children of Amram, That takes us down to Moses and Miriam and Aaron, the sons of Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. Of course, we know Leviticus chapter 10, what happened to Nadab and Abihu. They offered strange fire before the Lord, and that didn't work out well for them. What was strange about it? Was it attitude, or was it source, or what? The details are not given. They did something wrong, and fire went out from the Lord and consumed them, and their father was not permitted to mourn for them because of this. Eleazar fathered Phinehas, or Pinchas, as they would say it in Hebrew, and Phinehas fathered Abishua. Abishua fathered Buki, and so on and so forth. The lineage of the Levites coming down. And notice what it says down here in verse 14 and 15. Azariah fathered Sariah, who fathered Jehozadak, and Jehozadak went into exile when the Lord sent Judah and Jerusalem into exile by the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. So the main priestly family goes into captivity. Think about the implication of that for the people of Judah. Now, why did they go into captivity? Yeah. Well, they didn't observe the law. They didn't let the land rest. They didn't keep the law. They were faithless. They disobeyed. But even so, as God sends them to punishment, who does he send with them? Well, he sends Daniel, and Ezekiel's already there, Daniel's already there, and so forth. But as we look at this, here's Jehozadak, a priest. God sends the Levites with them. And who are the Levites? Priests and teachers of the law. In captivity, for 50 of the 70 years, they have no temple. They have no sacrifices. This is the time period where the synagogue comes into existence because they have no temple. They have no sacrifices. They have no Hebrew schools like they'd had before. Their worship is disrupted. And what does God do? He sends into captivity with them the very people that were supposed to be teaching them and instructing them in righteousness all along, so that they are without excuse. They can't say, well, we're over here in this strange land. We don't know anything anymore. No, you've got the books, you've got the parchments, you've got the record, and you've got the teachers and the priests right there with you. And at least some of them are doing their job. And that's a good thing. Now, in the rest of chapter 6, you have the record of what the various sons of Levi did. And you come down here to verse 11. These are the men whom David put in charge of the service of song in the house of the Lord after the ark rested there. They ministered with song before the tabernacle of the tent of meeting until Solomon built the house of the Lord in Jerusalem, performed their service according to their order. And you've got the list of names here. Heman, the son of the singer, the son of Joel, the son of Samuel. So Samuel's grandson is one of the writers of some of the Psalms. And others here, the sons of Kohath, and the son, his brother Asaph, who stood on his right hand, son of Berechiah. And these are writers of some of the inspired writers of some of the Psalms, and they served in the tabernacle. We have the record then of Aaron and his sons serving in the tabernacle, and then a record of where they were, their dwelling places, the cities. And the thing that stands out when you think about where God put them, where were they? As these people, after conquest and exile and restoration, as they read these names and these places and these words, those who are in the promised land, they can look around and see some of these places. And when they came back from captivity, they passed by some of these places in the territories of the other tribes as they were traveling. And God had salted the Levites among all the other tribes, specifically to influence them for good. And the fact that they didn't always live up to their responsibility, well, that's on them, not him. But here, these generations are being reminded, this is what God did so that you should have been without excuse. Even the half tribes of Manasseh had their contingent of priests and Levites to teach them and guide them and instruct them. And if they didn't go in the right way, that's on them. God always provided for them, regardless of their faithfulness or their faithlessness. God was always giving them opportunity. Well, chapter 7 brings us to the descendants of Issachar and Benjamin and Naphtali and Manasseh and Ephraim and Asher. And that will lead us then up to the time of Saul. And our time is up for tonight, so we'll not go into the details of these. We may take a quick look at them next week, Lord willing. Questions or comments before we dismiss tonight?
Hi, this is Rex.
Hey, Rex, I'm glad to hear your voice, man. I thought maybe that was you coming in a while ago.
Yeah, that I don't know how to get that owner off like the last class. I still don't. So
Don't know how to what?
it says owner on my
Oh, that,
name.
yeah, that doesn't matter. We know who the owner is.
You know who I am. Okay.
Yeah.
Good to be back.
Good to have you back, sir. Are you in Arizona or are you still in Ohio?
No, I'm in Arizona. So
Well, good. It should be warm there.
sorry I was late tonight. Hopefully that won't happen again.
Well, that's all right. We'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Yep.
Miss Roslyn, you can come in person. You can sit here with Shantae and Sharia. Started to say Sharia, and that didn't sound right. But we'll let you come and see your smiling face in person if you want to. In the meantime, Sam, you can too if you want to come clear out to the other side of town.
I'll try some nights. I'll try to make it some nights.
You brother. Y'all take care, ladies. God bless, and we'll see you next time, folks.
All right, thanks, Dave.
Right.
All right.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
All right, y'all take care. Have a great week.
Have a good week.
You too.